are you with us?
Vivek, greetings. Good afternoon, I guess. You are in San Diego, California now, I believe?
Yes, correct.
Okay, well, let me introduce you. It's a pleasure to really have you as a distinguished Chief Executive Officer. All the more so that we have heard that one of the chief exports and concerns regarding the India market for the state of Georgia is aviation, air, and space, and areas in which I suspect you have a great deal of expertise. But also, it's great to have you join us from the vantage point of your corporation and being in San Diego with a unique perspective on the Asia-Pacific basin and markets. So just a few words about you for our audience. You are the Chief Executive of General Atomics Global Corporation, based in San Diego, but really affiliated with companies operating over the 5 continents. You are involved in unmanned aircraft. You provide electro-optical, radar signals, intelligence, automated surveillance systems. I will not enumerate all of these product and segment area. You have recently received the President's Lifetime Achievement Award in September 2002, and you have numerous achievements to your credit. You are an aeronautical engineer, having received a PhD in the field, an area which is well known at Georgia Tech, since we have one of the distinguished aeronautical and space engineering colleges in the United States, the Guggenheim School. So without further ado, we are looking forward to your presentation, and we'll be following that with some questions and answers.
Thank you, Dr. McIntyre. It's an honor and pleasure to be here. And thank you, Ani, as well, for this kind invite. So I'll just start with some general comments. India, of course, has made major progress in a number of advanced technology fields, but there is continuous progress to broadening that technological base. And in order to remain a leader in the Indo-Pacific region against which are very obvious growing adversary influences in that region. This includes the need to diversify and create additional scientific and technological institutions that attract global talent to further strengthen its indigenous capabilities in cutting-edge high technology and basic sciences. The logical approach to dealing with this situation, in my view, is to strengthen existing ties between India and the United States, especially by moving into more substantial collaborations with high technology content. With India's demographics and industrial might complementing US technological entrepreneurism, the two nations indeed form a natural partnership. Given their shared values, this relationship enjoys strong bipartisan support in both countries. And there is great merit to expanding the partnership framework toward a knowledge-based economy through formal collaboration in high-tech areas of common interest. I would like to suggest 3 areas in which I feel international collaboration has long proven successful, and in particular in the US-India corridor. One would be national defense, the other would be energy, and finally space. These 3 fields in which the countries are already working together, but I do think progress in these high technology areas is strongly correlated to overall economic prosperity, and properly established cooperation will help keep the 2 countries at the forefront of future international political, economic, and social order. Moreover, successful collaboration in these areas is likely to spawn a number of joint India-US efforts in other matters of mutual interest, for example, health, education, information technology, and indeed climate change. Defense has emerged as a major pillar of the Indo-US strategic partnership, with progress in defense trade, joint exercises, personnel exchanges, maritime security, and counter-piracy. The aggregate worth of India's defense-related acquisitions from the US exceeds $25 billion. In June 2016, the US recognized India as a major defense partner to facilitate technology sharing to a level commensurate with that of top allies and partners. India was elevated to STA1 status, which allows India to receive license-free access to a wide range of military and dual-use technologies related to the Department of Commerce. The US and India continue to enhance peacekeeping collaboration with the Indo-Pacific partners. Military exercises enhance US-India relations and help create a more stable and secure Indo-Pacific region. And as you know, both countries have inked key defense and security pacts over the past few years. Pacts like LAMOA, COMCASA, BECA, so forth. Taken together, these long-established ties and the new forward-looking pacts establish, I believe, the framework needed to push ahead with extensive collaboration on a number of high-tech defense activities of mutual interest to both nations. So I think one of the key areas, of course, within that framework is intelligence sharing. The technologies underpinning intelligence gathering, including innovative instrumentation to acquire data, the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning to extract facts and trends from a myriad of data sources, and of course, cybersecurity to protect the information gleaned are important areas. And I think all these areas have enormous spin-off potential and should be emphasized in any attempt to broaden each country's talent pool. Each field is ripe for collaboration, and government-sponsored tasks are clearly the place to start. AI/ML is a critical area of interest because of its key contribution to the evolution of humanity, saving time, costs, and opening playgrounds outside of human physical capabilities, accelerating the time frame that countries will need to improve their education systems to prepare their citizens for the job market of the future. Cybersecurity, of course, as I mentioned, is another good example. Both countries have been at the receiving end of cyber threats from state-sponsored and non-state actors. International cooperation has been challenging in this area because of the lack of mutual trust between several nations, but this is not a concern for India and the US. The structural complementarities between both these economies, especially in the services sector, which is a major user of cyber networks, provides further motivation for the two countries to cooperate in this sector. Of course, existing trade agreements cover many time-tested military systems, but attention is called here to two quite modern systems recently brought into service by the US that would have lasting value to the defense in India. Unmanned aerial systems, of course, and special importance given borders and hostile actions. And the second, of course, is aircraft carriers, an important class of assets for a country with an ocean boundary thousands of miles long. Involvement in the technologies that constitute the essence of these systems will advance high-tech aspirations of the Indian economy as well as strengthen the military posture of the country. The other area I'd like to touch on briefly is energy. The quest for energy independence has animated both India and US policies. Both countries want to avoid the entanglements that come from over-reliance on countries with fundamentally different set of values. India has had to meet the rapidly increasing energy demands of a growing population and an even more rapidly growing set of industrial demands, while the US is increasingly influenced by the need to address the adverse effects on the climate of the burning of fossil fuels. So India's own huge plans to realize energy sufficiency span the entire spectrum of sources, from coal to nuclear to biofuels to renewables. And so I do believe this is another very important area. I'll briefly touch on nuclear energy, as you know, our company is deeply involved in nuclear fission as well as fusion. and the most robust source of clean continuous power, nuclear fission, has much to offer in addressing India's energy security needs in an environmentally acceptable manner. Shifting to smaller, lower power units is being studied as one way to improve planned deployment schedule. Termed small modular reactors, the notion is to reduce the physical scale to permit factory fabrication, provide economies of production, and compacting the construction schedule. Such an approach would reduce the capital outlay required to build a power plant, but its effect on the life cycle generation cost of electricity remains debatable due to diseconomies of scale. The US brings technological innovation to this problem, supplementing that with the manufacturing expertise that India has that could provide a way forward in that arena. On nuclear fusion, what I'd like to say is that, both countries envision magnetic fusion as playing a central role in the world's long-term energy future. Both are active contributors to the ITER, the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor in the south of France, and it's the most ambitious fusion endeavor. And of course, the US has an aggressive domestic research program as well. So, and it's mostly science-based, but I think the focus will tend towards technology to prepare for demonstrating an energy-producing fusion device that will serve as a starting point for commercialization. So I do think there are win-win propositions there as well between US and India, and it's something both countries are well placed to exploit. I'd like to then touch on space, as I mentioned earlier. The US, of course, is a pioneer in advancing and implementing space technology. Building on the successes of its satellite and moon programs, moon exploration programs, India is now joining the ranks of the world leaders in this area. And, there is a very strong history of collaboration between NASA and ISRO, the Indian Space Research Organization, which forms a firm foundation for pursuing future collaboration with greater high-tech content, and you see that playing out in the current scenarios. Another area, of course, as relates to space and an intersection of space and nuclear, is the development of requisite nuclear technologies for space missions. It's at an early stage. Active collaboration with India would spur the pace of development. Synergy between nuclear capabilities and ambitions of both countries, I think this is another area to certainly explore. So what I'd like to conclude my remarks by saying that, investment in R&D is only one aspect of an effective portfolio of policies to foster innovation spanning regulatory, tax, and other matters, as well as fiscal allocations. It underscores the need for continued and enhanced active involvement by government in nurturing science and technology-based innovation in both the public and the private sector, and thereby also increasing employment in relatively well-paid high-tech industries in the countries. Strengthening these assets is wise public policy that will stimulate economic growth and contribute broadly to national prosperity in the coming years. No one country has a lock on the best ideas, as we all know. If the next generation of scholars and experts are to save the globe, and not one country, but the globe in general, collaboration is essential. And I think India and US are perfectly positioned to lead the way. And one final thought is, in my view, there are 6 stakeholder buckets that need to be engaged in the US-India dialogue and are engaged in the US-India dialogue. One is, of course, the political spectrum. The second is the bureaucratic spectrum. The third is the industry-to-industry ties, the business-to-business ties. The fourth is academia, very important and often overlooked. But the academic community, the think tank community is very critical. Then, of course, you have communications and media, and how you perception sometimes becomes reality, and so how do you nurture that in the right way for collaboration? And of course, the last bucket I would say is the end user of anything that we're trying to, keeping that in mind, the end user, all these other buckets of stakeholders have to formulate policy and implementation methods to make sure that the end user, if it's a common person or it's an institution, actually benefits from all the dialogue. So with that, I will pause for any questions.
Thank you very much for a very rich and ambitious presentation in terms of agenda setting. I'm fascinated by your 6 buckets, each of them representing a huge amount of effort and continuous deployment of assets and thoughtful thinking. I have several questions that come to mind in the multitude of topics you have broached on. One relates, first of all, to nuclear energy, given India's drive to energy self-sufficiency and ensuring the end of brownouts, which has affected, among others, the aluminum smelting industry, as you probably know. You mentioned the US and India sort of collaborating, with the US on the one hand seeking more consciousness of fossil fuel impacts and decarbonation, while India is moving forward in the march to industrialization and diversification. This raises the issue, a question of nuclear energy. In Georgia, we've just had a nuclear power plant go online in the last few weeks. I don't quite recall the exact detail, but it made world news. Similarly, in France, the Macron government has again committed to a building program, which is slowly getting underway, as well as maintenance and repair on the existing plants. Where is India in terms of nuclear energy? Please tell us a little bit, because I am at a loss to understand where India would be on the nuclear spectrum, nuclear energy, civilian nuclear energy spectrum.
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned in my remarks, that's an excellent question, Dr. McIntyre. Clearly the needs and the requirements are great. India's not only the population, but the industrialization and the aspirations and the growth trajectory, GDP. India is that trajectory, in my view, is going to continue, and therefore, I think nuclear energy becomes a very, very important part of the portfolio of energy sources, and as it becomes more relevant and more important to focus in on nuclear energy, and as more power plants, typical traditional fission power plants, come online, the whole concept of small modular reactors in the context of the Indian geography and landscape becomes, I think, a much more relevant discussion in the years and months and years ahead. And the second part is, of course, fusion. I think that, for clean, limitless and energy, there's initiatives in several countries that have started up. You mentioned France. I recently had the opportunity to brief President Macron as well about the fusion strategy, and many countries are looking at fusion and seeing what is the next steps to make it a reality in terms of not only proving the science but then commercializing it, etc. But I think even Japan recently launched their new fusion strategy, where they are involving not just the governments but private sector, etc. There are a whole rash of startups in the US in the area of fusion. So I think also the US-India potential collaboration on fusion would be a real sweet spot to hone in on, because you have scientists in both countries that are very well steeped in this area and have lots of decades of experience. And as I mentioned, with India's manufacturing prowess and some of the intellectual prowess that exists in both countries, we can actually accelerate that schedule, because you talk to some people and they say, well, fusion is very far out in the future. But I think it can move from science to technology sooner rather than later. And then doing it at a price point that's acceptable is obviously a key aspect of all of this. And so I think there's a lot of work ahead, but I think that's the direction things will go.
You, among the six stakeholder buckets you mentioned, one, of course, I would be remiss not to mention it, is academia. So how do you increase collaboration between industry, your particular industry sectors, and academia in the Indian context? What's missing? What are the key ingredients that are missing to speed that up?
Yeah, no, that's, this is very close to my heart, the academia corporate relationship in terms of businesses, not only in the US, but in India, and how to, overlay the government to government initiatives that leverages the great talent and abilities of academia and the universities, such as Georgia Tech and others. I think in many of these high technology areas, for example, US and India just launched the Critical and Emerging Technologies Initiative.
Yes.
And I think there are various areas in there, whether it's semiconductors, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's quantum computing. I think structurally, academia needs to be part of that, not only the conversation, but the relationships that are gelled in these areas, so that you have the world's best professors and talent, and in fact, the future generation of students being incorporated into this dialogue early. We at General Atomics, for example, we have a very strong internship program. We get people from students from many universities, and 70, 80 universities every summer. And I think the nature of the collaboration between Indian universities and US universities, there's a lot of scope to increase that multifold. The one unique aspect that I found, especially with Indian innovation and Indian universities, is the price point. So the cost at which you can achieve certain new innovations is just so attractive that I think it's not just good enough to do science or technology, but doing it at an economically viable price point is going to be critical.
Is there a lot to be learned from the Indian frugal innovation model as relates to space, which is really remarkable, and we're all really in awe of the manner in which India has discharged its ambition in space at a fraction of the cost others have undertaken. Yeah,
absolutely. You're spot on, and it is really a remarkable achievement by India to have achieved that, and with those type of parameters in mind, because ultimately, we live in a global environment and a competitive environment from a business standpoint, and so economics will factor into the future in a more significant way.
I had one quick question, which is close to my own research interest regarding dual-use export control. You mentioned the SDA status and license-free, in particular, in certain dual-use fields between the US and India. Could you say just a few more words? I realize the subject is rather large and wide and high, but how do you think it's going to turn out?
Yeah, I've been observing the US-India story for 20 plus years, and there has been great leaps in all aspects in a positive way in the relationship, but certainly from a dual-use technology, from a licensable activity, from an export controls perspective, I have seen that things are way more positive than they were even 10 years ago. and the street is two-way. It's not a one-way street from a technology transfer standpoint. You know, great credit has to be given to the startup community in India. We are working with an artificial intelligence company and a semiconductor company in India. Again, startup companies. However, the expertise and the talent, because they tap into the global pool of talent, it's not just restricted to one particular geography. They come up with products and solutions that are truly world-class. And oftentimes those have, again, dual use components. And so I just think those floodgates have opened up, and we'll see much more of dual use technologies. And there was a time when military technology would, you know, creep into commercial products.
Yeah.
But I've seen the reverse happening, where commercial products and softwares and services creep onto the military side. So it's a two-way street there as well.
Well, thank you very much. I think we're reaching the end of the time allotted. I wanted to express our thanks on behalf of the organizers, and also extend to you an invitation to visit Georgia Tech. I know you know the institution pretty well, but if you're in Atlanta, please do let us know so we can organize something for you.
That's very kind of you, Dr. McIntyre. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Ani, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Lall. We really appreciate your remarks and look forward to forging our relationship as you take US to a new path of new frontiers with India. And we keep reading about you. Thank you for your service to the country, and we look forward to staying in touch with you.
Thank you so much, Ani. It's a pleasure and honor to be here.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
With this, we will now move to our next phase of the program schedule. And I am delighted to introduce Mr. Ravi Venkatesan. Ravi, are you there with us? Hi. Thank you. Thank you for joining, Ravi. Yeah. You've been staying busy?
Spinning, for sure.
Thank you for joining us. And I would like to, for our audience, his bio was part of the program which we have scheduled, but I would like to read a few things about Ravi. He's CEO of Cantaloupe Inc., which is based in USA and Atlanta. Ravi is based in Atlanta, and company is going leaps and bounds in terms of providing services in wellness topics and also public speaking coach. Ravi is also passionate about applying mindfulness and meditative policies to improve workplace relationship and productivity. He has conducted several leadership and wellness programs for multiple companies. Ravi is also a regular panelist and speaker at events including TAG, CIO, Supernova Atlanta, and events by Georgia CIO Leadership Association. Thank you, Ravi. We would like to hear from you, and after that, we have some questions about your industry. So go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Ani. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and share some remarks. This is a forum that is close to heart and a topic that's close to heart. And I think the timing is excellent to have this conversation, as we've heard from previous speakers. Dr. Lall's remarks were especially instructive. And what I'll try to do is I'll try to piggyback and take off from a little bit of where he left off. I think you've got enough of a bird's eye view. And what I want to deliberately do is avoid repeating sort of what we've all heard about how all the numbers around where the strategic collaboration between US and India have come to. And I want to deliberately, go a little more subjective, if that makes any sense, right? So the approach I want to take is I want to talk to you about what I view as three buckets or three trends that are going to be very instructive on where the relationship goes from here, between the US and India. Many areas of collaboration and cooperation. My focus is going to be more business centric because I lead a NASDAQ listed technology company and have a vested interest in that. but I'll try to give you a broad view of that. So the three trends I want to cover are: one, what's going on with bilateral versus multilateral relationships, right? In general, what's happening? Are countries preferring these coalition-based approaches where, things like NAFTA, and then on the India side, things like the Quad, are these going to become more important, even the G7, G8, G20, whatnot? Or is it the bilateral relationships that are going to become more important in the near and midterm future? The second trend I want to cover a little bit with you is on the culture side. What's happening with cultural alignment versus just very different ways of looking at things, and how does that play a role, particularly in the business relationships between India and the US, and even broader, how the countries are engaging. And then the third trend I want to cover a little bit is geopolitics, right? What's happening in the geopolitical world. I'm sure you've heard enough of it already, but I'll give you my 2 cents on where that's going to have an impact. And then I'll round out by just giving you a little bit of a quick fire, SWOT analysis of my view of kind of the top 2 strengths, 2 weaknesses, 2 opportunities, and a couple of threats around this relationship and where that's going. Okay.
Right.
So to dive right in, so let's talk about what's going on with bilateral and multilateral relationships. It was interesting when President Trump kind of almost looked like he was going to blow up NAFTA, and he did shift things considerably there. Everybody looked at that askance and was not sure what's going on. Now, the fact of the matter is that as US navigated that, we have actually improved our collaboration, our position, and our relationships in all those cases, right? The US-Canadian relationship is pretty strong. The US-Mexican relationship is pretty strong. So what you saw happening in that one microcosm area was that the bilateral relationships ended up being stronger and more powerful. Now you're seeing a lot of that happen, whether it's China and Russia. We may not like what's going on there, but you look at the trend, or whether it's the posture India has taken, which in the case of Russia in particular has been very interesting. India continues to buy a lot of oil from Russia, which has been a source of annoyance and irritation for many on the US side. And at one point, it looked like that could threaten the relationship. But I think India has navigated that in an artful manner. And to its credit, the US has responded in an artful manner as well. So long story short, what I'm seeing happen is, while there is always going to be a place for the multilateral relationships and the big associations of multiple countries try to come together and solve a large problem. And I think when it comes to things like, ESG, right, essentially saving the planet and environment and, emissions and cleaning up the oceans, the big problems where you really need multiple countries to come together and align, that's going to be needed. But when it comes to nuts and bolts, let's get the economic engine juiced up. I think what you're going to see is that the economic conversation shifts way more to be a bilateral conversation versus a multilateral conversation. So that's trend number 1. Let's shift to the culture side. I grew up in India. I studied in India, and I joke about it. All of my education is there, and my entire professional career has been here. So I graduated business school. The first job I found was, a company based out of Atlanta. And so all of my professional career has been here. And, it's been 21 years, but I still, when I visit India about 4 times a year, but every time I go back and forth, I still see the significant cultural difference, which causes dissonance, which causes disconnect, and just creates unnecessary friction in how companies work together and how individuals work together. So when I think about what is meter moving, I think it's really figuring out how to get both sides educated more on the culture side. And what's unfortunate and ironic is when the early kind of the IT wave happened, right? So if you think about the industries, the export of manufacturing, whether it's pharma or textile or chemicals. It didn't need that level of collaboration and interaction and cooperation. So you typically had liaisons that were very good at knowing both cultures, going back and forth, and made everything happen, right? So you could have 10 factories in India producing pharmaceuticals, and you could have, large hospital systems consuming it on the US side. Trade is happening, everything is going, no problem at all. Or you could have wheat being exported from one place to another, no problem. So agriculture, manufacturing, the interactions were not so much, and culture didn't play such a big role. Now you get into high tech and you get into services, you get into business process outsourcing, and suddenly people have to interact on a daily basis. And so the whole game has shifted. And in the late 90s and early 2000s, when this wave had started, you had a lot of training that started happening. I remember before coming to the US for my first job, going through pretty intensive training on here is the culture in the US. Here's what you need to be aware of. Here is how to speak football versus cricket, right? All those things. Now I don't see companies do it. I don't see people do it. So it's almost like we've become complacent on the culture side. And I would argue that a big opportunity is going to reinvigorate that, right? Reinvigorate, understand the need and the importance cultural education plays on both sides, and kind of reinvigorate, right? So that's a second trend. And I'm seeing a little bit of that happen. Within culture, I also see a trend of what I would call India doing a pretty nice job of soft power. If you pay attention to what's happened with yoga and Ayurveda and some of the things that India has originated, but been very generous and willing to spread out and provide to the world, particularly to address wellness, I think that's working very, very well. And I almost see that as a soft way for that cultural, dissemination to happen, and understanding of where each other comes from happening. And I think the US would do well to do more of that in the other direction as well. Of course, US's best export has been Hollywood, but in addition to that, I think there can be many other things that happen. So then the third trend was around geopolitics. And look, in geopolitics, like in any other field, we joke about it these days, everybody's a macroeconomic expert. Everybody knows when there's going to be a recession, what's going to happen. And I remember having a conversation with one of our former board members, who was also the chief financial officer at JP Morgan Chase. And I said, hey, how do you feel? Because he's a true expert, right? So I said, how do you feel in an environment where everybody is a macro expert? So he said, yeah, everybody's a macro expert. Some just have more information than others. It was very striking, the comment. So geopolitics is also like that, right? Everybody is an expert these days because we all listen to the news. We all read the papers, but some just have more information than the others. And if you happen to have conversations with those experts, true experts, what is interesting to pay attention to is that the China factor is becoming disproportionately large. And it's becoming disproportionately large for India. It's becoming disproportionately important for the US, but actually also for the Middle East and also for Russia in a different way. So what's happening is that in some ways, China and where it's headed and what happens there is driving how much the US does with Mexico, how much the US does with India. So a lot of these, these dots that you don't think have a connection are getting connected. So what I would encourage anybody who's interested, particularly in the India-US business relationship, to do is to really study China. And by the way, China it's not a positive or a negative thing. In fact, I would argue in many cases, it's actually in the interest of the India-US business relationship for China to be stable. China exploding is not a good idea for anyone anywhere in the world. So sometimes I talk to people and they are naive enough to say, yeah, it's great that the China-US relationship goes south and US will start exporting everything or sourcing everything from India. It's not that simple. In fact, there's a lot of things where India sources parts and components from China and manufactures it and exports it to the US. What about that, right? So I think a little bit more of a careful thought process is needed, and an approach where we understand the supply chain, which is much, much more complex than it used to be. And the business that I run has a lot of that. So, I get insight into it, and that's why I'm sharing this. So the war in Europe, I think we've heard enough about from many, 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 many people. That I view as something that's going to have a short-term impact on everything, including the US-India business relationship, if anything, slightly positive. However, in the medium to long term, I don't think the war in Europe will have an impact. I don't want to conjecture on when that's ending, what's happening, how that's ending, but it looks like by and large, it's been factored in, right? So that's, again, to summarize, the trends are moving more towards bilateral relationships versus multilateral. Culture is starting to become important again. I think it would benefit both the US and India to reinvigorate it. And on the geopolitics factor, I think studying China and really paying attention to it is actually important for US-India business relationships, as counterintuitive as that may feel. Okay.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So I'll take another maybe couple of minutes and go through my quick SWOT, and then we can open up for some questions.
Sure, absolutely.
So when I think about it, the top two strengths, I think, for India-US business relationships, the top one by far is, I think, the Indian diaspora, the people that are settled in the United States, that are now in positions of power and influence, and that are willing and able to engage in a dialogue to help that relationship more and more. That continues to, in my mind, be the number one strength for this relationship. The second one, which used to actually be a significant weakness and has pivoted thanks to the current Indian government, is the Indian government's willingness to cut red tape and shift to a much more business-friendly posture, right? Now, is India like Ireland or, a place where everybody wants to move their headquarters to? Not yet. However, the leaps and bounds of progress that has happened in e-governance and in just cutting out the bureaucratic processes to establish an entity, to start doing business, to start doing exports, to take money out and to bring money in for purposes of investment and for purposes of repatriating earnings, all that has, it's not even in the same ballpark in terms of how much change has happened in the last 10 years, right? So that, I think, is a huge strength for the bilateral relationship because, let's face it, as Americans, we don't like doing business with, we don't tolerate red tape easily, right? Right. And so that's been a big factor. The top two weaknesses, I think, is the way these types of bigger ideas work, particularly when you talk about moving more manufacturing and trying to, hedge against China being kind of a place where the world has all their eggs in that basket. It requires longer term investments and bigger capital. And right now, the economic environment, as well as people's mindsets, have shifted to where the appetite is very less. So the kinds of organizations and the kinds of both private sector and public sector that can write big checks and wait for a long period of time, it's starting to get less and less. And I think that's a weakness right now for our bilateral relationship, and figuring out how to do that. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it just has to be governments that step in versus relying on companies and businesses and trade associations to do that. That's a challenge and a weakness right now. And the second one, again, based on my trend, I think cultural differences continue to be a weakness. If you ask me, as an American business, is it easier to do business with Mexico? Is it easier to do business with Japan? Is it easier to do business with China? Is it easier to do business with India? India is still pretty poor on that list. In fact, many of the East Asian countries have been more nimble and better at engaging and in being able to create an operating model. And so that, I think, continues to be a weakness. On the opportunity and threat side, I think opportunities, look, manufacturing collaboration, I'm sure you'll hear it from everybody else, and I'll expand on that too. I have a slightly different take. I think manufacturing collaboration has been great in what I would call 1.0 areas. And 1.0 to me is pharma, textiles, chemicals, and auto. And I think now we need to head into 2.0, which is all about semiconductors and aerospace and high tech, right? And high tech in particular with artificial intelligence and what we can do there. So I think on the manufacturing side, the smart manufacturing and how to create an efficient and effective supply chain and to move away from the only reason for manufacturing to be moved being lower cost labor is critical for the relationship and for both sides. Because at some point you're going to have enough smart factories with 100% robotic automation to where the labor cost itself will not be a big driver. So you really need other reasons in the long term to be successful in that space. And then finally, on the opportunity side, high-tech collaboration, I think continues to be great. It's the one area where India has a positive trade balance with the US. And so as from just a balance perspective, continues to have a high interest in making sure that that grows and that expands. And I think with the landscape in cyber in particular, so AI and cyber would be my top two areas where I think that collaboration can improve. And then to finish this, the top two threats, I think insular behavior continues to be one. Whether we like it or not, both the US and India have many times fallen prey to, be very insular and even xenophobic sometimes behavior. And those winds keep changing based on politics and, who's in power, what's going on and what's popular. And, so there is a little bit of that threat that I think always ends up being there. And I think it's also linked with the trade balance. So, historically, India has always had a negative trade balance with the US in terms of, importing more and exporting less. And that's been comfortable. Now, as this next phase of the relationship emerges, it will be interesting to see if the US has a negative reaction, if that balance starts shifting. And it has been shifting, right? So that's one where I think at least my radar is, up on that to monitor the trade balance and the insular behaviors. And then the second and last threat I would say is deglobalization, right? Overall, there's general trend towards deglobalization, as it's being called fashionably. And it's all about every country trying to say, hey, I got to be self-sufficient with food. I got to be self-sufficient with semiconductors. I got to be self-sufficient with, precious metals or whatever. And honestly, it's just going to put everybody backwards significantly. And so with India-US relationships, if that trend doesn't creep into that relationship, it will be positive. If it does, that would be negative. And so I view it as a threat. So again, just to summarize, my top two strengths are the diaspora and cutting red tape. Top two weaknesses are capital for long-term investments, cultural differences. The top two opportunities are collaborating on manufacturing and high tech, and the top two threats are insular behavior and kind of deglobalization. So with that, open up for any questions, any thoughts that people might have.
Right. Well, Ravi, you have really laid it out very well. I think we need to expand your session, We'll add 30 more minutes to this session. Unfortunately, I don't have that leeway today, but probably we have to address some of the things which you have raised today in our next program. But I have a few questions from the point of view of your remarks and thoughts, which I made note of it. In terms of your industry, self-service commerce industry, how do you describe the readiness of Indian businesses industry for cashless acceptance of technologies?
Yeah, it's actually very good. India is in fact leapfrogged, I think, the US in terms of real-time payments. And what India has done with, UPI is unprecedented in the world, right? In terms of rapid adoption. So in fact, many of us are studying that model and seeing how we can bring that back in here because the US has quite frankly lagged in real-time payments Fed Now is a move that's trying to address that. So I think if anything, it's the opposite when it comes to just cashless payments. Now, if you pivot that to automated vending or automated sale of products and services, India is way behind. And partly it's because of theft, and there's a higher level of theft, and partly it's because of labor being cheaper. So there isn't as much an imperative to move towards automated dispensation of products and services, but it's happening. In fact, the growth rates are astonishing. The growth rates of automated self-service dispensing of products and services is more than 100% in India, where it's closer to 15% here.
Wow. And particularly, from Cantaloupe's point of view, did you experience any challenges while doing in business India? And you can sort of answer this in a very generalistic term.
Yeah, currently we source from India, so we source technology talent from India. We source sometimes products from India. The challenges we have faced is, in trying to migrate portions of our supply chain there, and the challenges have continued to be around skills and around, just being able to create the most efficient way in which components can move from China to Taiwan to India to sometimes Mexico, because we have all these countries involved in part of a complex supply chain right now. And we did find that India had it was a little bit harder to get that going with India.
Right.
I was quite impressed, Ravi, by your presentation.
And I know you have like 20 questions by now. But
yes, I must say, it's the presentation I should give my students on the first day of class. I love your SWOT analysis. It's really using a micro system to really address complex bilateral US-India relations at different levels. So it's a presentation that more Georgia Tech students should hear. I believe you're in Atlanta.
I am. Yeah.
So it wouldn't be too hard to bring you to Georgia Tech or connect you for a class or seminar or something along those lines.
Sure, anytime.
You have a lot of lessons for the students who are really budding executives in MBA programs and the like. So really deeply appreciated your mixing different levels of analysis and modes of analysis.
Right. John, I have a quick question. I'm sorry to interrupt here. This question is from Dhar Jatipati from audience. What do you see, Ravi, what do you see the impact on USD to INR? US dollar to INR, like strong US dollar to Indian rupee? Yeah.
So look, there's an old economic theory called interest rate parity. And I'm yet to see it disproven in the long term, right? In the short term, it fluctuates, it varies, and things happen to it. But ultimately, where you have a higher interest rate, the currency will keep getting weaker. And if you have a much lower interest rate, the currency will keep getting stronger. So my prediction or impact on that, on the USD INR equation is, just look at interest rate parity and do the calc. And in the short term, you may be proven wrong, but in the long term, you won't be.
I had one last question on the question of India and the US, particularly comparing the commitment to the famous or infamous UN SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. How do you see the relational flows going? Can we learn from each other? Are there sort of dead ends where really some of those goals are unreachable, plain and simple?
I don't think they're unreachable. I think the challenge that's coming now is whether it's India or even China or some of those other countries, they feel it's a little unfair that they are now being asked to step up to the plate and contribute, where in the last several decades, the rich world has kind of enjoyed the fruits of not doing it, right? And almost, and so I think it'll continue to be challenging, but I believe there is much more of an appreciation for the criticality of playing nice in the sandbox. And so I'm sensing a shift in forget what's happened, but we are all in it together, and we need to get behind these goals and really put our full strength to it. At least that's what I'm hearing also from Indian sort of political people that I'm connected to in some way, shape, or form.
Thank you very much. We're doing a major conference at the University of Delhi School of Economics at the end of November on the UN SDGs and the Indian approach. My center and others in France in particular are collaborating on that. Yeah, we've got about 110 papers, mostly from India, on the topic. I'm sure you won't be surprised by the number.
Yeah, I'm not surprised by the number, but that's excellent to hear.
I see Rick laughing, he knows.
Indeed, it was a pleasure to have you today as part of our program. We appreciate your partnership and support to UIBS and look forward to working with you for our future edition of events too.
Thank you.